Chapter 4. Broken. John Hamman, 43. Cretaceous. Manny returned with a dozen men and news from the river. A large herd of trikes had moved down to the river near the camp. They were mean animals with about the same personality of a black rhino, but about 3 times the weight of one. Unlike the rhino, they traveled in herds. It might be worth moving the camp farther away from the river. They would move on in a day or so, but he didn't want to be that close to the trikes. They fed on the ferns that covered the plain. They ground them up with their jaws like a cow chewed its cud. When they spread out looking for food, he didn't want members of the herd wandering into camp. He had stood watch over the kill. No predators made an appearance. She never stood up or tried to move off, and by now he was quite certain she never would. But just to be on the safe side, he unloaded the .375 and reloaded it with heavy, round-nosed solids. He traded it to Manny for the big double and moved in toward the kill. She was laying where she had been hit. He could see the wound. Frothy blood ran down from it into the dust, turning the ground black. A lung shot. She was quite dead. On examination, the bullet had passed through both lungs but missed the heart. It smashed the shoulder bone on the far side and had not exited. It was the broken shoulder that had grounded her. Not his greatest shot, but it had been rather long. The butchering went quickly. They removed the hindquarters, the 2 forelegs, and 1 side of ribs. It was all they could carry and would feed the camp for a week. The meat was slung under poles, carried by 4 men each, and they headed back to camp. It was a little over an hour, and the porters began to sing as they walked. This was actually a good way to avoid contact with most animals and even most predators. Most would avoid a larger group and tended to avoid louder noises that they were unfamiliar with. So sometimes it was best to go forth boldly, singing a song, even when you were carrying several 100 pounds of meat. They were still out of sight of the camp, about half a mile away, when they heard the first gunshot. He took off at a run toward the camp, but knew he was too far away. Manny ran beside him. Although he could have outstripped John, he would never leave his side. The one shot turned into a volley, then another, and then became more ragged and sporadic. The shot stopped before John crested a small rise and looked down on the camp. 2 of the trikes were down inside the camp, and another was a few hundred yards away. People were moving around, but he saw several bodies unmoving on the ground. All the tents were down, and supplies were scattered everywhere. This was precisely what he had been afraid of, and why he planned to move farther from that herd. They had missed the party. Slinging the big gun, they walked down toward the camp, trying to catch their breaths. It occurred to John that he was not as young as he used to be. Going from man to man, he found 3 of them dead, but one was still breathing with a badly broken leg. They brought a stretcher, and tying a rope through the injured man's crotch to the stretcher, John fixed a loop around the man's ankle and drew the leg down toward the end with a hitch. He tightened it several times as the muscles relaxed, drawing the leg out and putting tension on it. Without the tension splint, the pain would make the muscles contract, driving the jagged ends of the bone past each other into the flesh. They needed to get him back to a doctor if they were to save his life, if not his leg. Waiting, he watched the man's toes. Pinching them, he could see them refill with blood under the nail. That was good. The circulation still worked. Standing up, he looked around and saw the camp was in shambles. With the beast's poor eyesight, the large tents had drawn most of their wrath. It was a small group, maybe a family, that decided to charge through the camp. The men in the camp got off 2 volleys, and then it degenerated into mayhem. It was lucky no one had been shot. There were 4 casualties, but everyone else seemed to be unhurt. He called out to the headman, not to rebuild the camp, but to pack everything up. They were moving. Better late than never. He wanted to be farther from that herd before more started to spread out grazing. They were worse than hippos. He went to what was left of his own tent. He untied it and started to pull it off what remained of his possessions. Everything in the tent was thoroughly trampled. This was not good. His cot, chair, and small table were smashed. One of his fowling pieces was stepped on and bent, the barrels destroyed. He found his pack. It was torn open, the seam split from where it had been trampled. Only one thing in the pack really mattered. He opened the special waterproof pocket in the top of the pack. He smelled the acid immediately. That wasn't good. He looked inside. With a shirt wrapped around his hand, he began to pull out what was there. The batteries were smashed, the acid leaking everywhere. The material of the pack was already falling apart. The device appeared undamaged but was becoming discolored from the acid of the battery. He pulled it out onto the ground and poured some water over it from a canteen. He had to use some of the water to wash his hands off, as well as they started to burn. The batteries were another story. He always carried 2 of them, just in case. Both cells were completely smashed. In truth, it was the one part of the device he understood. The original power source, he couldn't really call it a battery, as it was far too small, was long exhausted. It made electricity, and a normal cell of the same voltage served the same, or it always had. Now, looking down at his battery and its backup, both lying smashed on the ground in front of him, he felt a cold shiver run up his spine. They were in trouble.